Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. I am Ariana Summer, your host. And in today's episode, we're exploring the intricate pathways where science meets the essence of human experience, our breath. Joining us is Dr. Jack Feldman, whose groundbreaking work in neurobiology illuminates how the simple act of breathing shapes our mental, emotional, and physical health. Dr. Jack Feldman holds the David Geffen School of Medicine Chair in Neuroscience, and he's a distinguished professor of neurobiology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He discovered and named the pre-Bötzinger complex, an area on the brain stem that is responsible for controlling breathing. He also was the recipient of the Huxley Katz Prize from the Physiological Society in 2017. In our conversation, we explore the profound implications of his discoveries, revealing insights that expand our understanding of what it means to live a fully oxygenated life and the science behind the breath's power to transform. Jack, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. I am so excited for our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I've always had a deep interest in the interplay between physiology and wellness, and I'm really very intrigued by your work on the neuroscience of breathing. Could you share with us how this journey began and what inspired your focus on breathing's neural control?
It's a sort of convoluted history. I grew up as a kid, was very curious about how things worked. In the old days when mechanical washers were pretty cheap, I would take them apart and try to figure out how they work. Never had much success putting them back together, but was always interested in sort of the inner workings of things. And I grew up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn where we were very verbal and witty, and I realized that I don't want to pursue my life that way. I don't want my life to be based on how witty or quick I was. I wanted to know something that was things that were true. And that sort of led me down the path of wanting to be a scientist. And my initial interest was trying to understand the conception of space and time. I read some philosophy, and the philosophy was word descriptions of space and time, which I didn't find satisfactory. And it led me into wanting to study the physics of space and time. And I pursued that by choosing a graduate school where I had the opportunity to work with one of the world's great cosmologists. But it was a time where in graduate school, people were exploring lots of things related to sensation. And I myself did some personal experimentation and found that my perception of space and time really varied when I imbibed in certain psychedelic drugs.
Ah.
And I began to think, and this was not the present, this was a long time ago. This got me thinking a lot about space and time, that it wasn't simply as the physicist thought about it, the way I perceived it really mattered a lot to me. And I read a lot about the brain and perception. I said, gee, I really would like to figure this particular thing out. And I got really interested in how the brain worked. I went to my physics advisor, and he was very nervous. He says, the brain is too complicated. You're never going to figure it out. Because when he asked me what I want to understand, I said, look, ultimately, I want to understand how I recognize my grandmother. And he said, you're never going to do that. Find a simple problem, and if it's simple enough, I'll give you my permission to work on it. So I read a lot, and I read a lot about vision. Vision struck me as an interesting problem a physicist could tackle. But ultimately, I settled on breathing because I thought it was simple. We all do it. We do it all the time. We can measure, as a physicist, you want to be able to measure things. I can measure everything that was important about breathing, about oxygen, carbon dioxide, the movement of the muscles, the movement of the lung, airflow. And so I knew what the outputs were. I knew what the inputs were because at the basic level, we're regulating oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, all one had to do was figure out what was going on in the brain. And I thought that was going to be relatively simple because it's an oscillation. It's something that goes up and down, back and forth. And as a physicist, I had a lot of experience with that. There were lots of tools to work on it. So I said, I'm going to figure out breathing. And then I'll go on to figure out all these other things about how the brain interacts with the world. It turns out that I, as a physicist would do, I did a model of how the brain generates breathing rhythm. And I went off to learn how to do experiments to test that. And when I did the key experiments, it turned out I was very naive about biology and physiology. I had a physicist view of the world, which meant that you can break things down to very simple fundamentals and build up from there. Whereas the fundamentals in biology were not so simple. They were very complicated, very detailed. And I relied on papers I read, which described experiments about breathing to build my models. And yet when I did experiments, I found out that the data that I read from published papers was not really representative of what was going on. So being pretty obsessed and stubborn, I decided to do experiments, which sort of blew up a lot of what we thought we understood about breathing and started from scratch again and started building that up. And it turns out that breathing is a lot more complex than it might seem by just looking at the in and out of air. And this is for a lot of reasons, which we can discuss. But part of it is that we need to realize that the breathing is doing something really profound. It is generating this movement from actually before we're born. We have to practice. So we're working when we're born. So we're doing it in the third trimester in utero. We do it when we're born. We do it 600 million to 1 billion times in our lifetimes, reliably when we're awake, when we're sleeping. It has to be very labile. In other words, when I'm sitting here, I'm using a certain amount of oxygen every minute, about 250 milliliters of oxygen per minute. But when I do something as mundane as get up and walk out of the room, because my muscles need more oxygen, I'm suddenly using 800 milliliters a minute of oxygen. So I tripled my need for oxygen, and yet my body only holds 1,000 mLs. In other words, 250 mLs per minute, I only have 1,000. I only have a reservoir of 4 minutes. So I have to do this continuously. But if I greatly increase my need for oxygen, I have to increase my breathing in order to make sure I have enough oxygen in. So it has to be extremely reliable, 800 and 600 million times. It has to be extremely labile to do it on in all these different circumstances. And that's a real challenge to do. Plus, the movement of air is not just for my physiology. I have to have reflexes to keep my airways functional. I have to cough, I have to sneeze, I sigh. I need to control my air flow for speaking. So I'm using the same apparatus now for all these different functions. How do I build that so it works? And it turns out it's pretty complicated. The analogy I use is a wall that I took as a kid. Walk around in a circle, that's pretty simple. I just need a spring that unwinds. But not about it to be reliable, accurate, robust. And if you're part of what you see all these gears, what's happening in the brain, there's a lot of work. Sorry to be so long-winded about that.
No, not at all. And here we're back, of course, to air and breathing. This is really fascinating to me, Jack. And I have never, in one fell swoop, thought about the breathing mechanism and how many different ways we use it. And You spoke of the physiology of it. Of course, that alone is like a huge world unto itself for me, for the layman's person's mind. And then there's, talking about mind, drawing from my own explorations into mindfulness and its physiological underpinnings. I'm really curious about how breathing influences our mental states. And I know you've talked about how it can affect those. Could you discuss the how breathing can modulate our emotions and also our cognitive functions?
Sure. Let me start out by prefacing this by saying we've known that changes in breathing pattern can affect emotion and cognition for thousands of years. This is not a recent discovery of me or any neuroscientist. We've known this mostly from Eastern culture, but it's been well known. The behavioral aspects of it, I think, are very well described. And I think there's no doubt that it works. The question is, why does it work? It's a good question. Why should change? We're taking a single deep breath, calm me down. There's no a priori reason for this, but it happened. And the question is, how did it happen? And why is it happening? And the various approaches to this, but let me start off by saying that when we look at the brain, and I'm talking about the part we associate with higher function, and we record activity there, we find in most parts of the brain, there's a background activity of oscillations that are related to breathing. Some of it may be coming in from the nose, from the olfactory system, because we inhale and exhale through the nose. And by doing that, we send signals to the brain about odors. And so when we inhale, the signals go in. When we exhale, they drop down and then they go up and down. So we have those olfactory signals. We have signals coming from the lung. So every time we inhale, we expand the lung, and there are special receptors in the lung that are sending information via the vagus nerve into the brain. So we have that as another place. We have the central generation of the breathing rhythm. That is, we have circuits in the brain stem, which is the part of the neuraxis, the nervous system, and the back of the neck. That is the engine that's generating the breathing rhythm. And that is not simply going to the muscles that are generating the breathing movements, but it's also going throughout the brain. So when we record in the brain, we find these breathing oscillations. So they are there. What do they do? When we look at how the brain is processing signals, we find that in addition to the activity of the 80 billion neurons that you have, which are all behaving whatever way they want, there's also a certain degree of synchrony amongst them at different frequencies, different oscillation frequencies. These are called brain waves, and they have various names like delta and gamma and beta. And neuroscientists have speculated what these waves are doing in terms of how the brain normally functions. We don't believe they're just epiphenomena, that they're there but don't do anything. And there are two ideas that have come out and I think are generally accepted. One is called binding. Right now, you're seeing me, and that information is coming in through your retina, through your eyes, and you're hearing me, that information is coming in through your ears and through your auditory system. But see me as two different things, a video and an oral track. You see it cohere. You see it as one thing. Question is, how does that happen? Because the signal is coming into your brain in two completely different ways. One of the ideas is that when signals come in and they're riding on the peak of a wave that's appearing throughout the brain, you attribute them to potentially being related to each other. When one's on the peak and one's on the trough and the lower part of the wave, then you begin to think maybe they're not related. So being that the signal from my voice and the visual signal are coming in at various parts of this wave, you synchronize them. And we probably have all had the experience when you're watching a movie or television where the sound gets a little out of kilter, it gets shifted a little bit, and you have a difficulty processing it. That's where you're shifting the signals that should be simultaneous. So you see the lips moving, but the sounds are delayed, and you're thrown into a bit of dismay because of that. So these oscillations are very important. Now, we see these oscillations related to breathing in the brain, and it's clear that when you abolish those oscillations, for example, you interfere with the olfactory signal coming in from the nose by wiping out the olfactory receptors, the receptors that respond to odor, you see a change not only in the waves in the brain, but in behavior when these experiments are done in rodents. So clearly, they're playing some role in the way the signals are processed. And so if they're playing some role in the way the signals are processed, amongst all these oscillations, the only one you have volitional control over is your breathing. You can't really control your delta waves and your gamma waves. Maybe a yogi who's done it for 20 years can do it, but you and I can't do it. But we could change our breathing pattern. And we change our breathing pattern from, let's say, 15 breaths per minute to 5 or 6 breaths a minute, which is common in breathwork practice. That's a huge change. And what it turns out this does is it alters the signal processing in various parts of your brain, for which the outcome is that you feel calmer, your cognition is better. Now, why it should make you feel calmer is a different story. But the phenomenology that it makes you feel calmer is well established. And it's almost certainly because you're changing the way the neurons interact, because you're changing that background frequency that's just changing a little bit. So if you're very anxious and you take that deep breath, you're just throwing it off for a little bit, and it'll take a while for it to come back. But for a little bit of time, you're calmer. If you do it for 5 minutes, you'll find that you have a longer lasting period of calmness. If you do it every day for 5 minutes, you may find that there are longer lasting effects, and you may find that it affects your levels of stress, your anxiety, physiological variables, your blood pressure, your all sorts of things that are related to stress get changed by doing this. Now, what we've been focused on in my lab is trying to understand how the breathing signal is influencing higher brain function. We have an idea which is highly speculative about why this happened. But let me tell you about one piece of data we had that we published several years ago. The region that's generating the rhythm of breathing is something that we name the pre-Bötzinger complex. And if anyone listening to the podcast wants to know how we named it, there's a 5-minute podcast on the BBC that they can just Google and listen to it. It's an interesting story. So the signals from the pre-Bötzinger complex are going from there to other relay neurons, ultimately to motor neurons, which are the neurons that control muscle. And so it's going from pre-Bötzinger complex, for example, to the diaphragm, which is the principal respiratory muscle. And so when the pre-Bötzinger has a burst of activity, it ultimately results in the diaphragm contracting and air flowing in. When that burst subsides, the diaphragm relaxes and air flows out. So that's how you get the cycle of breathing. What we found quite surprising was that there were also projections from the pre-Bötzinger complex to regions not normally associated with movement, regions that were associated with higher brain function. In particular, one site called the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus has been well studied and very important in matters like attention and mood, and signals from the locus coeruleus almost go throughout your entire brain. So the locus coeruleus has the ability to modulate and modify brain function over a broad domain. We found that there were projections from pre-Bötzinger to locus coeruleus. Then we did a simple experiment. We being my colleagues at Stanford, Kevin Yackel, and Mark Krasnow in particular.
Are you back? Oh, Jack, can you hear me?
Yes.
Pardon me, you
Yes.
just froze and you were just starting to talk about the locus coeruleus. And I would be sad to miss that. Would you mind just you can just start again.
Sure.
The locus coeruleus.
Okay. Yeah. So we found that in addition to projections that ultimately go to the muscles, we found projections of neurons from the pre-Bötzinger complex going to locus coeruleus. And the locus coeruleus is a very special place in the brain stem that in itself sends projections to very many areas of the brain. So by changes in activity in locus coeruleus can affect activity in large parts of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Working with colleagues at Stanford, Mark Krasnow, Kevin Yackel, Li-Chun Liu, we were able to make a very specific change in those projections. We actually were able to knock that projection out. So no longer was the projection present between pre-Bötzinger complex and locus coeruleus. And when we did that, by all measures, the mice were calmer, significantly calmer. So we speculated that this would be a pathway by which signals related to breathing can result in calmness. We published the paper, and the paper went viral. It was in all the usual places and attracted a lot of attention. There were also other projections from pre-Bötzinger complex that go to regions that could affect emotion and cognition. There's one that goes through the region called the parabrachial nucleus, the direct projection. So that's a site where the internally generated rhythm of breathing can directly affect it. So we have the pre-Bötzinger complex, we have the olfactory system, we have the vagus, and with breath work, it's typically volitional. Okay, you're slowing your breathing down or speeding your breathing up or holding your breath. The volitional signal has to ultimately impact on the pre-Bötzinger complex. But what can easily happen is that the signals coming down the neuraxis to the pre-Bötzinger complex can send off collaterals and go to other regions. So this signal coming down, which is changing your breathing pattern, could be projecting to regions of the brain that are controlling emotion. And therefore, these signals can again affect your emotional state. So there's lots of different pathways, and we're in the process of trying to disentangle them.
This is fascinating to me, Jack, and I would like to take this to the practical application if possible. For myself, breath work, consciously breathing in very specific ways has been super helpful for dealing with anxiety that may flare up or high stress states. Let's take a high stress state that's not necessarily life-threatening, but I remember, and this is quite a few years ago, I was not quite as enmeshed in mindfulness or biohacking, really focusing on my breath, but I knew a little bit about it. And I was invited in Germany to a late night talk show to speak about one of my last books. And I remember sitting there and feeling so nervous prior to going on stage. I was so nervous. I think there's a English phrase, sweating buckets. I was wearing this beautiful dress, and then I put these, Kleenex under my armpits because I knew, oh my goodness, I'm going to sweat through this dress. I was so nervous. I had to remove the Kleenex, go out on stage. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, I certainly do not want to project this state of stress just because feeling watched can trigger that, feeling watched by a group or television audience. And so something popped into my mind, and I just remembered something that I read: breathe in, breathe out very calmly. Use your body also to signal calmness. So instead of crunching up in the chair, I just sat relaxed, I expanded my arms. I tried to embody what I thought of as a regal pose, and I just breathed calmly. After about 2 minutes, the state of anxiousness and stress dissipated, so much so that I actually enjoyed this wonderful opportunity being a guest on this TV show. And so much so that after, on via social media, many friends and acquaintances reached out and said, "You are so composed. How did you do that?" Yeah, so I would really like, and this is many years before I knew what I know now, and I know I still have, the more you know, the more you have to learn, right? But I would like to take this to perhaps some practical insights that people who are listening to our conversation could take into their lives. Are there particular ways of breathing or breath work that you are very familiar with, that you personally found very useful, or perhaps in talking to colleagues or other people found, yeah, really useful, particularly to, yeah, evoke a sense of calmness and a clear mind, to get into this Jedi mind state versus this fight or flight, I'm so nervous, what am I gonna do?
Okay. Well, I do breath work.
Mhm.
I don't want to be in a position to proselytize about anything in particular because these things can be very individual. But let me give an analogy. Take someone who does an exercise. We all know exercise is good. They've been a couch potato.
Mhm.
Don't tell them to get up and run a marathon. You don't tell them to squat 500 kilos. You say, get up off your butt, walk around the block. Okay. When you feel comfortable doing that, twice around the block. And eventually you may get comfortable that you may now begin to do something simple, but a little bit more intense, like jogging. Then you might reach a point, okay, I'm into this exercise thing. I feel comfortable. I want to optimize my strength, or I want to optimize my endurance, or I want to optimize my power. There are lots of things you might want to optimize. Depending on what you want to optimize, there are different exercise protocols. Okay. If you want more power, you may do one thing. If you want more endurance, you may do something else. And so for a lot of people who ask me, who say, how do I get into doing this? What should I try? I think there are two very simple entry points. One is box breathing,
Mhm.
which most people, as soon as they get into breath work, hear about it. It's basically inhale, hold, exhale, hold. This has been around forever. I am told that Navy SEALs
Mhm.
use this when they're under conditions of stress, and I would speculate that it's probably even more stressful than being on a television show.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they use this to cut those down. And there are free apps you can get too. And it's very simple. And I would say, just try for 5 minutes. Do 4, your breathing every day to about get comfortable in it. See if anything happens. And try it a few times. You may not see something the first time. And then the breathing patterns. Another one I try is 4 inhale, 7 hold, 8 exhale, where there's active exhalation. And based on our discovery, the fact that there's seen a second circuit in the brainstem for generating expiratory movements. That is, you have an inspiratory oscillator and an expiratory oscillator. When you engage active expiration during meditation, it probably involves other things than when it's just a passive relaxation.
Mhm.
So these two kinds of breathing patterns, 4-4-4-4, box breathing, 4-4-4-4, or 4-7-8, may actually invoke slightly different things.
Mhm.
Then from that, there's many different styles of breathing. There are some which can be very intense, like Wim Hof or
Yes,
holotropic breathing.
yes, and I wanna know your thoughts on that. This, what Wim Hof's technique is, cyclic hyperventilation, right? It's very popular. I have friends who swear by it. I'd like to hear your scientific take on cyclic
Okay.
hyperventilation.
Okay.
Effect on
Let,
health, performance.
so let me make a comment. I think what Wim Hof has shown, particularly about changes in his own physiology, are bona fide. It's clear. I tend to be very cautious when it's a one-off individual doing something. Sometimes it would be like me learning basketball from Michael Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he could show me from now to the end of my life how to dunk a basketball from the foul line. I'm never going to do it. He has a person who is very different from the rest of us. I'm not saying he's a freak. I'm just saying he's just different than the rest of us. So I can't follow his protocols. Wim Hof seems to be capable of doing some things which are beyond the range of what many people can do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the degree to which he is, as a result of intense practice on his part, like yogis may do, or he has a physiology which is not the same as identical to the mean of everyone else, but is somewhat different. So with that disclaimer, I'm not bad-mouthing what he says. I'm just saying that we have to, I am a little bit careful.
Yes.
When you hyperventilate, so in box breathing, your blood gases, your oxygen and CO2 are probably going to stay about the same. Your oxygen levels are going to stay pretty well close to the same, and your CO2 levels are going to stay pretty close to the same. When you hyperventilate, your oxygen levels stay pretty much the same, but your CO2 levels drop. When your CO2 levels drop, you get a change in the acid-base balance of your blood, your pH. And every cell in your body is very sensitive to your pH, particularly brain cells. And so if you have a deviation in your pH in the brain cells, there will almost certainly be changes in many aspects of the way your brain functions, including things that impact the Wim Hof method. I'm not saying it's negative. I'm just saying that would be the mechanism that it affects CO2, whereas many other breathing patterns, like box breathing or 4-7-8, are unlikely to affect them. So he's dealing with something that's a little bit different. Also, if there are long periods of breath holding, when the long periods of breath holding, your oxygen levels can drop and your CO2 levels can rise. Here again, you're manipulating both oxygen and carbon dioxide and pH. Those things can have profound effects. There was recently a study on holotropic breathing, which is a very intense breathing practice, which had presented data which the authors interpreted as a psychedelic-like experience. And they argued that this potentially could be used therapeutically, where now psychedelics are being used in a non-drug related way of getting the brain into those things.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't doubt that happens. And I think that a likely mechanism is you're making very significant changes in your CO2 levels, which are having effects on your overall brain function, which could have effects similar to what psychedelics are.
Yes.
We don't know very much. I'm sorry.
Oh, please go ahead, Jack.
No. So what I'm saying is the phenomenology is pretty strong, except in papers that are one-off papers, you have to be a little bit careful. Their results have to be repeated. You need blind controls and whatnot. But I'm much more ecumenical about accepting the behavioral studies. What I'm interested in is what the mechanisms are. And there's also the potential for placebo effects. We know placebo effects are very profound. And one of the questions we asked ourselves a while ago was, how much of this could be placebo effect? So I'm going to tell you a little story. We said, okay, we work on rodents. Suppose we can get rodents to meditate. I know this sounds crazy, but we figured out a way. Took 3 years for one of the people in my lab to figure this out, that we could get mice to breathe slowly on our command. And when I say slowly, mice normally breathe 4 to 6 times per second. We can get them down to maybe once per second. So almost a factor of 10, we can slow their breathing down. We do this in awake behaving mice. They're walking around in a chamber, and we slow their breathing down for 30 minutes by a factor of 5 to 10. We do this 30 minutes a day, 7 days a week, for 4 weeks. Then we turn them over to a colleague who's a world expert on rodent fear. He tests them for their response to a fearful situation. Turns out they're remarkably less fearful than control mice. So we're in the process of repeating these experiments because the results are so mind-blowing. We want to make absolutely sure that we got it right. But what this indicates is that, first of all, we have the same effect in mice and humans. And because mice won't have a placebo effect, it's not a placebo effect. It could be a placebo effect in addition in humans, but the basic component we're seeing in mice. Now, if you see it in mice and you see it in humans, you begin to say, maybe this is common to all mammals. And so when we thought about this, we came up with an idea about how this happened, which goes back to a question that you asked earlier. Why should breathing affect us? One of the things that allows mammals to be warm-blooded and have big brains is that we evolved to have lungs that have huge surface areas to allow us to absorb lots of oxygen. And when you say huge, the surface area for gas exchange in your lung is about 70 square meters, which is about a third the size of a tennis court. And that's all compressed in this 2.5 liters of lung, of chest air. So how did nature do that? Nature did that by taking the trachea, which is one tube, and branching it more than 20 times and ending in little spheres called alveoli, which are about 1/10 of a millimeter in diameter. They're really tiny. But we have 500 million of them. So you take 500 million of by times the small surface area of these tiny alveoli, you got 70 square meters. The downside of that is that these alveoli have a small probability of collapsing. Now, when they collapse, they're all fluid lined. And if you ever try and blow up a wet balloon, you realize it's very hard to do because water sticks to itself. You have what's called surface tension. And so if any of you people listening to this podcast who don't believe me, take a balloon, a little water inside, make sure the whole inside surface is wet, get all the water out, make sure the sides are sticking to each other and try blowing it up. And what they'll find is they can't just put a normal breath in. They're going to have to blow extra hard to pop the balloon open. A normal breath doesn't pop our alveoli open. You need a deep breath or a sigh. So you normally sigh about every 5 minutes, 12 times an hour. Well, a lot of people don't believe that. And what I would say, if you don't believe me, lie down someplace that's quiet and listen to your breathing. And you'll notice every 5 minutes, you take a bigger breath. And you can't stop it. Every 5 minutes. Now, if this is occurring in mice, because they have similar lungs to we do, they're just a lot smaller animals. If it turns out that engaging in a sigh is also calming, because we know that if we take a spontaneous deep breath, we're calmer. If that happens, let me give you another piece of data. When you're stressed, your hypothalamus, which is an important part of your brain, which releases hormones and peptides, when you're stressed, it releases certain peptides that increase the rate at which you sigh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, why would your hypothalamus do that? When you sigh more, you tend to be calmer. So it's a way where stress induces an action which tries to make you calmer. We can imagine that we take the mouse. If the mouse is calmer when it sighs because it needs to keep its lung function, and a mouse that would sigh when it needed to be calmer, like it was escaping a predator, would have a greater chance of survival. And so you can imagine, as a just so story, late at night after a few drinks, you say, okay, what happens is the mouse or the early mammal that was able to calm down would be more likely to survive because they took these deep breaths. And so we think that over evolution, that this is what happened, and that basically the brain hijacked the breathing signal because it was there all the time. It's there all the time. It's there, and you can control it. You can't control all your other rhythms, so you control it. So if you're a little nervous and tense, just take a few deep breaths as you did before you interview, and it's remarkably calming. And so our ideas evolved out of the physiological need to sigh. We now see that it was now hijacked to produce this calmness.
Interesting. And what you said now, and also the survival, how it relates to survival when you're in a calmer state of mind. You mentioned Navy SEALs before, connected to box breathing. A friend of mine is a former active duty Navy SEAL, and box breathing is, yes, that's something that's with his teammates, he still does. And if you look at people who go into serious high stress situations where the stakes are literally lives, their own and the lives of others, whether it's paramedics, whether it's firefighters, whether it's police officers or military, you will not see them running around like crazy and stressed. And no, it's all very organized. It's walking very calmly when possible into a situation. It does not come out of this fight or flight response where everything is, your chances of survival and that of others diminishes greatly. Something else that I find interesting is there's these phrases, not so kind. There's this insult in the English language, I believe. I think you call it mouth breather, right? In Germany, there's this saying, I think it also refers to so-called mouth breathers, that, when it rains, it will rain into that person's mouth. It's a very particular turn of a phrase. So considering nasal versus mouth breathing, and there's quite a nuanced debate within the health and wellness community about this, I'd appreciate your expert perspective. How do these breathing modes differentially affect our well-being and our physiology?
Yeah, it's a topic of great interest. But let me add something to the previous conversation about using breath work to calm down. There, not only do you have to be in life or very special, I use it routinely for two things. First of all, if I'm driving a long distance and I get fatigued, I pull off the road and do breath work for 5 minutes. I feel rejuvenated. It's pretty miraculous. You know how I would just push and be drowsy and say, oh my God, if I fall asleep, I'm going to die. I just pull off the road and 5 minutes, it works. The other time I use it is that I think it's fairly well established that after lunch, you have a postprandial depression. People are a little less effective in doing their work after lunch. I find after lunch, if I take 5 minutes and do a little breath work, I'm re-energized for the rest of the afternoon. It makes, for me, an incredible difference in my productivity. So this is just using it as a tool for everyday life. Now, as far as nasal versus mouth breathing, I think I've evolved into I was very neutral about this for a long time. I'm reading the literature. I've become convinced that it's preferable to be a nose breather. That the signals coming in through your nose to your brain is a powerful signal that's coming in with every breath, and your brain uses that signal. There are hormonal interactions that happen with nasal breathing that don't happen with mouth breathing. So I would say under normal circumstances, mouth breathing is preferable. I'm maybe not over at the 99%, but I'm saying that nose breathing is preferable if you have problems with nose breathing because you have some obstruction or some injury or swollen tissue, it is worth the effort to see what you can do to remove that increased resistance. Now, there are times where mouth breathing is essential when you have to greatly increase your ventilation, like when you're exercising at high levels. You cannot move enough air through your nose. There's just limitations. The path is not very straight. You have obstructions in the nasal pathways, and it's not particularly efficient. But if you mouth breathe, you can move a lot more air. And certainly mouth breathing is important for speech. You take air in, you take air out. So it's not something that has to be avoided at all costs. But I think that given a choice, you want to be it's better to be breathe through your nose than through your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people who feel uncomfortable with that, I'm not going to report them. But I think in general, it's good. If you know someone who's predominantly a mouth breather, you might ask them politely and see whether or not there is something that is affecting their nasal passages. There are individuals who report it helps them with sleep. And now you can buy tape to tape your mouth. And some people report that it's beneficial. I spoke to a colleague of mine who's a pulmonologist with an expert in sleep apnea. And he says some of his patients have tried it to success. Others have tried it without noticing any difference. But if something is low cost with very low side effects, I say try it. If it works for you, that's great.
And the same, just to circle back to a few minutes ago when you talked about breath and the altered states that many proclaim can be achieved. There's people who literally say you can get high on your own supply. It doesn't cost anything. It's legal. It's accessible anytime. So yes, to make use of this. How about I practice Kundalini yoga? I've just gotten back into the practice a few weeks ago. And also in the quote regular yoga or hatha yoga, there's breathing practices. For example, when you breathe in through one nostril, breathe out through the other. And I find it quite calming. The different teachers use it for just releasing certain emotions, getting into a calmer state. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. A priori, there is lots of evidence that the olfactory signal is not going from each side, is not going uniformly to the same targets. They tend to be somewhat different. You breathing in through one nostril versus the other can easily set up a circumstance where you're altering the signal processing non-uniformly, left side versus right side. We know the brain is lateralized. For most of us, for right-handed, it's all coming from the left side. Speech is localized. And so to the degree that signals might be altered on one side or the other, it's certainly possible. I don't know how good the data is in terms of doing well-controlled powered experiments. So I will be ecumenical here in saying, if it works, I would say go ahead and use it. I think that some of the descriptions about the effects may or may not be actually what's happening, but there's also a component of placebo. If an instructor says it's going to do this or that, it may predispose you from doing it, and it may also do that. So I don't want to get a lot of hate mail from your listeners. I'm not saying no. I'm just saying that you have to understand my perspective as a scientist. I have to be skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical. So when something is asserted, I'd like to know the degree to which there's substantive evidence. And when there's not substantive evidence, I'm a little less willing or not willing to accept it as fact. And my threshold for accepting something is fact, where I would turn around and say to someone, this is fact, you should pay attention to it, may be higher than most other people. So take what I say with a grain of salt.
Absolutely. And this is also why you're such an expert within the realm of science is because you follow the protocols, you follow the science. I find it very interesting because what we just briefly spoke about, it's called pranayama, so the yogic practice of breath control, which they say it enhances life force, prana, right? And they also say that it can induce neuroplastic changes or improve cognitive functions. I wonder, have you heard about any studies that have been done with regard to this?
Yes, there have been studies that have been done, and there's a interesting review written by Tanya Bentley,
Mhm.
Bentley, who she looked at, I think, 3,000 published studies,
Mhm.
and they set criteria for what was going to be a study that they would feel they could use as strong evidence. They only found 85 studies that met the criteria.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things that are published which by a rigorous bar would not be easy to say, follow this as dictum.
Cer
And yes, there are studies. I just don't know quite where they fall. But I think the behavioral consequences have been known for thousands of years in Kundalini yoga and the other yoga practices. I would recommend you speak to my colleague Helen Lavretsky,
Mm,
and I will send you a link to an evening we did. We were both on stage being interviewed. She's a psychiatrist and a yogi who
wonderful.
uses breath work to treat patients. And she is much more versed in the various types of breathing practices. She says she went to a retreat recently where she was introduced to a new breathing practice, or one that she wasn't aware of, called frog breathing. And I won't embarrass myself by trying to repeat the pattern, but there's all these different ways. And given that the signals are in the brain, there's all sorts of ways you can imagine they can have differential influences. And I just can't speak with any expertise as to which does what. All I can say with great confidence is that simple breath work can be beneficial.
Mhm. Yeah, I can respect that. I appreciate that, Jack. And I'd love to talk to Helen. I'm really interested in breathwork and clinical settings, the potential for integrating breathwork into therapeutic practices. It sounds like she'd be an amazing person to talk to about that. So,
Uh,
yes, I would.
she would be quite amazing. When we're done, I will send you a link to this evening we had, and you should just contact her. She's a wonderful person,
Super.
and she really works with people. And she did a study a long time ago, quite a while ago, when she got into this, where she showed that you had actually an effect on gene function
Mhm.
from breath work. And so this is skipping sort of people reporting changes in behavior and just looked at genes and found that there were changes, positive changes in gene function.
Mhm.
So there is real science behind a lot of this. And it's not just at the level I'm looking at as a physiologist or a scientist, but she's looking at it also as a neuroscientist, molecular biologist, geneticist.
Fascinating. That is
Yeah.
really something I'd like to do a deeper dive with. I will contact her. And the whole topic of breath to me is so intriguing. Just considering the historical reverence across cultures for breath as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual realms, the breath of life. This is certainly a phrase that many of us have heard. And yeah, I'm always curious how current neuroscience research aligns or maybe diverges from these ancient beliefs about the breath of life, which is more than just the physical, of course.
Efforts to find the noé vital. That was the French expression for the note of life.
Mhm.
So the idea was in the late part of the 17th century that there was some part in the brain that was the note of life. And when it was gone, there was no more life. And the noé vital. And basically, what they were looking for was the pre-Bötzinger complex because they thought it was the source of breathing. And we actually cite that in our original paper discussing this. Scientists have been interested in this. There's an emerging area of research looking at emotion, contemplative science, compassion as being something organic within the brain. So it's not just behavioral, and it's not trying to say, oh, it's just this neuron firing, that neuron firing, but to understand what's going on in their brains that is associated with that. So there's an institute in San Diego. I can put you in touch with someone there that studies this, and it's really interesting. And then there's a new group of neuroscientists called the International Society for Contemplative Neuroscience. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to give a lecture there. And there were people who were very interested in mindfulness, meditation, and whatnot, not simply as behavioral response, as why is this happening? Now, many people don't care why. They just want it to work. And I'm okay with that. That's fine. To me, I'm stuck with this curiosity. I want to know why it works. You can get in a car and not know how it works and drive it.
Yes.
So that's you could say it's like meditation and breath work. You don't have to understand it in order to take advantage of it. I want to know how the car works. I want to know how the engine works. And also, an engineer who knows how the engine works maybe can improve it. And if we understand how it works, we may be able to develop better, more optimal protocols. Just like with exercise for power, endurance, and whatnot. Maybe we say, oh, you're anxious, try this breath pattern, or you're depressed, try that breath pattern, because that's likely to work better. Knowledge is better, but it's okay not to have the knowledge if you want to take advantage of it.
Great closing words, Jack. And your love for discovering how it works in order to then potentially optimize it, make it better. That goes hand in hand for me with my love for biohacking. So that resonates very deeply. Really appreciate all the work you've done on such a profoundly important topic. And like you said, most of us get in the car, we don't know how it works. All of us breathe. Many of us don't even know how this works and what all it affects. For people who'd like to learn more about your work or potentially even connect with you, how and where can they find you, Jack?
Okay. Can I send you a list of things that maybe you can post?
Yes.
And then people can look at that. I think that's the best way. I'd be delighted to interact with people. I think that for me, I've been in the silo of my career, and it's interesting to me to discover that there are people like yourself who are interested in this, and I'm fortunate to have the ability to, at least at some level, communicate it to you. And I think it's great because everyone should know some of this. And I really thank you for this opportunity to be on your podcast.
Oh, it is my pleasure and deep gratitude from me to you as well, Jack. I consider it such a privilege to be able to spend this time with you, to pick your brain and breathe a little together. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
My brain will remain pickable, and I look forward to continuing to interact with you.
Likewise,
be well
Jack.
and breathe well.
You too. Thank you so much, Jack. Have a beautiful rest of your day.